You are listening to the e-flux podcast.
Welcome to the e-flux podcast. I'm Ben Eastham, editor-in-chief of e-flux Criticism, and I'm here today to talk to the artist and writer Shubigi Rao. Rao is a little over halfway through a decade-long project devoted to the history of book destruction. Entitled Pulp, it transforms her extensive research into the subject into a growing body of work encompassing books, films, drawings and installations that highlight and strenuously protest the eradication of knowledge, the censorship of ideas, and the extinction of cultures. Pulp is the second 10-year project to which Rao has committed. The first saw her adopt the persona of S. Raoul, a scientist, theorist, archaeologist, and scapegoat for whom Shubigi Rao worked as a biographer. Raoul had cause to regret encouraging his disciple to pursue her art when, in 2013, he tripped over one of her installations and died. A warning to all male geniuses, perhaps. Shubigi is also the curator of the current Kochi Biennale, titled In Our Veins Flow Ink and Fire, which evinces many of the same preoccupations with how creativity, humour, collective action, and optimism might help us to navigate a dark historical moment. Hello, Shubigi.
Hi, Ben. Thank you for having me here.
It's a pleasure. Thank you for joining us. I wonder if we might start in the obvious place and ask you why you decided to devote 10 years of your life to a history of cultural genocide, I suppose. Where did that impulse come from? Why that decision?
Well, we do measure our lives in decades, don't we? We think of our lives we talk about being in our 20s, our 30s, and so on. So there's a sort of contrivance that is also one of convenience. I think also because I had just done this 10-year project with S. Raoul, and while I was doing that, these considerations were already brewing. I suppose I'd had these concerns from the time I was a child. The concerns and anger, I think, at a lot of injustice and unfairness and different forms of what I could not name as oppression as a child because you don't have the vocabulary yet. But many instances that I saw of this. And I think that when the time came, I knew that I needed at least 10 years to deal with this. And it was really about book and library destruction that it was that lens through which I wanted to see and observe and sort of study and think about and also implicate myself in why our species is it defaults so easily to violence. And when I decided to do this as a decade-long project, I was also immediately aware, given not only the way I work indiscriminately in terms of subject matter and research, and the sprawling sort of untrammeled approach I have to things, but in the sense where I don't say this is not relevant. Everything seems relevant to me always. Plus, given the subject itself, which is of genocide and cultural genocide, and also resistance to it, I realized that 10 years is really just too short. And that's reflected in the full title of the project, which is Pulp, a short biography of the banished book. It's short because 10 years is just not enough.
Yeah, it's a project that could go on forever, I can imagine. I'm interested. Perhaps first you can tell us about the methodology of the project, how you go about it, how you conduct your research, and also maybe how that's changed over the course of the I guess 8 years you've been doing it for now.
Yes. That's so. One of the things I believe is that as an artist, but it really actually as a practitioner of sorts, artist is just a convenient term to use under which I can do everything that I really want to do, even if it's not really visual art. But the thing that I believe in quite firmly is that the medium has to serve the idea. So in this case, I realized very early on in the project, at the time that I wrote the first proposal for funding, because I knew I needed funding for this, just simply for the travel. I knew that it wasn't enough to rely only on books and literature as source material or research material. I also needed to travel extensively and meet people and listen to them and film them. So I taught myself how to film. So I'm Yes, I'm a self-taught filmmaker, which is quite an awful thing to have to admit to. But it's all, and I still use the same camera that I started with in 2014. It's lovely to be living in a time of DSLR technology where for a woman, because the most equipment isn't built for a woman's frame, especially mine that's small and largely unfit. But all my equipment fits on my back. I realized this was important because if you want to meet strangers and get them to open up to you, this is never going to happen if you have a crew with you. It's never going to happen in a large group. It happens when you're alone with somebody. It doesn't matter that you're strangers to each other, but there's shared kinship and there's shared anger and there's shared sorrow and there's shared joys. And I know these sound really simplistic in the way I'm phrasing it, but I don't, because there's so many different encounters, I don't really have the vocabulary to fully describe how complex and rich some of these encounters are. But this is the heart of my research. Meeting people, I just discover them through word of mouth. I don't work conventionally through usual channels or institutional channels at all. So I really just travel alone with my equipment on my back, meet people who then recommend other people. Because after about an hour of filming, there's this immediate kind of resonance, I think, or this kind of recognition in each other that of what we share. Ethnic and geographical and linguistic divides kind of don't matter in that moment, and they realize the ethics of what I'm trying to do, and also the reality of what I'm trying to do, my approach, and so on, which is to be very vulnerable, very open, and also, and when I say vulnerable, I don't need to act like a professional filmmaker to convince them of my legitimacy. It's enough that I care very deeply about the subject and therefore about them. By the subject, I mean the story, the story as it's unfolding. And so they always recommend other people. And I never do more than one take. It's all in one sitting. The participants can direct in terms of what it is they want, the direction they want the conversation to go. If they don't want to talk about something, or they retract what they have said, I do expunge it from the books and from my films. So there's this sort of appreciation that I believe is very important, because I've seen this too often, and I agonize about this as well. That as an artist, it's really easy to parachute and then use someone else's lived experience for your own project, and this makes me deeply uncomfortable. I'm sure there are times that I've done this without realizing it, and I keep over scrutinizing everything I do in the hope that I don't. But you have to be really careful with what you do. So this approach means it's essentially a completely solitary activity, which then makes it very difficult when you look at how the project has moved. So initially, if you're looking at the first volume of Pulp, I tend to think of each two-year moment as a volume. Also, because I release one book at 2-year intervals. I realized that the first one was a completely solitary activity, result of solitary activities, and that was I think the most important. You can see how it's shaped that book. There's a kind of gleeful smugness to certain passages that I deeply regret, which I have addressed in the third volume. It's where I've looked back and regretted, as you know, when you're middle aged, you regret your youthful indiscretions. I regret the smugness with which I spoke about pacifism as the last word, for instance. I mean, how smug of me to talk about pacifism being the ideal when, you're not attacked by culture, you're attacked with bullets and guns. I'm quoting someone who spoke to me in Bosnia, and she said that what we needed were the same tools to defend ourselves. We didn't need culture. We were seen as civilized victims. That's all that culture did. It made the world complacent about the urgency of stepping in to help and defend us. This is during the siege of Sarajevo. So I think that it's important to see that these confidences work in a way, and they must work in this way. They don't only appear in the books and the films and all that I do. They change who I am as a person. They destabilize me. They shake me out of my complacency, because we all are complacent. We have our blind spots. I mean, after all, the very first solo I did as Shubigi is called Useful Fictions, which is all about, how all the convenient lies we tell ourselves and the necessary illusions we must maintain to just get through with a semblance of self through, our weird existences. And this is really important to me. So by the time I hit this current moment in Pulp, which is this third installment of Pulp, it was for the Venice Biennale, and it meant that there were a large number of people involved. This was no longer solitary activity. So I'm sorry if I've jumped ahead a bit, but yeah.
No, I think that's precisely that. That trajectory is very easy to trace in the project. Actually, the first volume of Pulp feels very much like a polemic.
Yes.
There's it's a cry of frustration or rage even against the stupidity of a civilization which destroys knowledge. And by the third volume, and with the films that accompany it, it's turned into something much more polyphonic, as you say. It's much more your voice is kind of your position in relation to the books has changed, and actually it feels much more like you're foregrounding other people's voices. So I wondered if you could talk about, actually, you talked about this idea of the project changing your relationship to the subject material as well. In the first volume, you talk about nonviolence and pacifism as being the only way, I think, to confront the violence of book destruction and cultural genocide. And yet the encounters you have in the course of the project change that. And that's reflected in the form as well. And you talk about uncertainty, about these encounters introducing uncertainty or destabilizing your position, or maybe undoing some of the smugness and the certainty of your initial position. I wonder if you could talk about that, because it's interesting that a book which is so much about the preservation or the expansion of knowledge has as this thread that runs through it the gradual unraveling of certainty and the embrace of uncertainty, curiosity, and a kind of a withdrawal perhaps from an authorial position which is authoritative. So maybe that idea of uncertainty that you touched on, if you could expand on that.
Absolutely. Thank you. That's actually a really good point. And it's one that I, in a sense, foreshadowed in Pulp Volume 1, when I think it's in the afterword, if I'm not wrong, which is at the end of the book, obviously. And I speak about the power, when I speak about the power of silencing people, narratives, ideas in books, that it's not only wielded by the usual figureheads and the usual suspects, because I think it's much more than that. It's not just the historically extreme or the fundamentalist that does it. We are all authority figures, especially if you're parents or things like that, or we're in charge of any we shape anyone else's psyche. Even our casual encounters do that. I think we exert authority and control also over the way we think and present our thoughts and as action, and also the way we talk ourselves out of situations into which we found ourselves, where we are at odds with the ideological position. So we're constantly, this constant negotiation we have with ourselves is also one where there is a dominant voice and a submissive one, which is not always something we recognize and name. But I was aware of this. How would I explain it? I think I should just go and say it. I really dislike speaking from a position of authority. I detest it. I'm sorry to use such a strong word, but it sets my teeth on edge, which is why the second volume, the introduction, I name it, I call it gatekeeping, yes, but it's a lot more than that. I've heard people declaim from a position of authority, which is very often a bought position and not an earned one. Though also that's a contestable idea. How does one earn a position of authority, and should one even have to earn it, and so on. That's another tangent I don't want to go down. But I've always been aware of the importance of not being in authority, which is also why I publish the books myself, and I don't publish in a legitimate way. I don't follow the standard publishing process. I don't even distribute the books with any real gusto. I think there's just like 1 or 2 stores in Singapore where I stock them, and I'm very lackadaisical about getting the books out there. I'm not really interested in any one of those processes. But more importantly, when it comes to writing, I must admit that there's a particular delight that I take in self-evisceration. I don't know why I love it. I do it in my work. I do it when I talk about my work. You notice one of the first things I did was call myself smug. I like implicating myself this way because it also destabilizes the listener or the reader or the person who's making value judgments about the work I do. Because every time I have to speak about the work, the conversation then becomes about me, and it's no longer about the work. I've always felt the content should be the primary mode or the primary arena within which all the discourse occurs, which is why S. Raoul was such a beautiful, convenient fiction, my first 10-year project, because under his persona, I could, all the work I did, whether it was writing or art or anything, it was under his name, which meant that I was not the person involved or implicated. So it had nothing to do with me. People had to look at the work because there was nothing else or no one else for them to listen to or look at. And now that I'm making my work as Shubigi, I'm aware of the fact that as Shubigi, I might end up talking over the work. This is not such a problem if we look at the first volume, but it's a real problem by the time we hit the second and third current installments, because I've spoken to so many people now, and I don't want to be guilty of speaking over them. At the same time, I'm also aware, I think that maybe it's partly my bringing, and maybe it's also a gender thing, but I'm not comfortable being declamatory or being authoritative, even about things about which I know. I'll often pretend that I heard this somewhere else or I read this somewhere else, even if it's my own idea. In other words, I'd rather not take credit for something I've done because it does make me uncomfortable. I'm not fully sure why.
It's really interesting that you talk about authority in this way, and actually so much of Pulp is really a history of libraries as repositories of knowledge or stores of authority or infrastructures of understanding the world. And there's a tension there between the library as a model for a kind of knowledge which is of a kind of distributed authority, in the sense that it's the host for many different voices, for many different perspectives, but also that every library excludes and also creates systems of understanding within itself. So there's playing throughout the project, I think, is this kind of relationship to libraries or any kind of archive or any way of organizing knowledge, which is both desperate to protect it, but also suspicious of the terms by which it's organized. And I wonder if you think of Pulp as in itself a library project, as actually a means of gathering together many different accounts, not all of which cohere, many of which in some ways are quite conflicting. And what kind of library that might look like, whether you have I think at one point you can talk about almost a kind of archipelago model for libraries as islands of knowledge that might be connected by people moving between them or kind of trade routes, exchange routes. So I wonder how your thought about libraries as institutions has changed in the course of your research.
That's actually a really good question and a very topical one, because the main essay or the first section of the latest book is about the future of the library, and I put forward 11 propositions about what those futures could entail, and again, the power of libraries, but also the pitfalls that libraries face, and they have to negotiate, and also the kind of blind spots that libraries as institutional structures, or because of course I'm really generalizing that there's so many different types of libraries, but I think largely of endowed libraries that are either state libraries or large libraries that serve larger groups of people, community libraries and such. But I think those are the ones that are also that rely on certain structures that are more historical and therefore more likely to keep reenacting certain, perhaps I think they don't negotiate those pitfalls well. Let's put it that way.
Mm-hmm.
The terms of exclusion remain quite the same. There's a lot of tokenism that happens and so on. But at the core of it, the library has never been a place only of. When I say never, I mean I'm talking about in a post feudal understanding of the library. When I'm not talking about the domain of aristocracy, etc., or the royal library. I mean the library that serves the populace. Those libraries have, from the outset, actually served multiple functions. They are places for shelter, and this is important for growing homeless populations across the world. But they're also places where you can vote, you can have computer access, there's a certain measure of privacy, depending, of course, on where you are. But librarians have been in the forefront for the protection of borrowers' rights and privacy rights and such. And this is important when you're talking about places where there's voter suppression, for instance. There's also a place for community where a lot of people who fall off, don't have a social safety net, they fall through the cracks. The libraries are very often places that are there for children, for instance, or even for single parents. So it performs multiple functions which are not named often enough, but they are. You can see the difference when a library closes down, and you see what happens in the community, the disillusion of a lot of ties. So when we talk about navigating between libraries, I also like to think of how people navigate through them. At the same time, I don't think it's that important to have activated archives all the time. An archive or a library should not always be there to function as a place of borrowing and of community. Sometimes you preserve because you're not sure why you're preserving, but you have this sort of belief or this conviction that it's necessary to do so. And that's as important because we're talking now about libraries that are online. A lot of shadow libraries or pirate libraries indiscriminately have very often poor scans also, initially at least, of thousands and sometimes up to millions of PDFs, which are illegal, of course. But the point of that was it was just this indiscriminate collection of knowledge. A lot of the questions that were raised about the usage of these libraries centered around illegality, but that I think is besides the point. If you want to look at usage, it didn't matter whether those PDFs were being used or accessed or shared or that they were necessary. They were, that we know, but the because it counters the monetization of knowledge, which I think is a very important and preoccupation of mine in this project. The complete monetization of knowledge, and almost completely now it's sort of almost everything's being paywall quite successfully, out of reach, and it's not talked about enough. But I think that if you're talking about the e-library or the online library, the virtual library, the shadow library, pirate library especially, it's there for a certain reason, and it doesn't matter if people are accessing it or not. That's also why when David Cameron was Prime Minister, forgive me, Prime Minister. I think
that
was a Freudian slip. Okay, wait, it is because if you hear what happened, then you'll know why I think that slip up happened, El Presidente. Anyway, there's this. What happened was that the Tory party deleted a decade's worth of speeches. And they also blocked the Internet Archive's Wayback Machine from relocating it to reaccessing them, including David Cameron's famous speech about open access and internet. The internet is a bastion of democracy and all of that. So it was really very telling. Right now, the only way you can access those speeches is to walk into the British Library to one of their machines, physically walk in, because you can't get them online, and they're there as part of the legal deposit. So it's important when we talk about how libraries preserve to also look at how easily things can vanish. But the fact that they felt the need to delete 10 years of speeches, which is the act of I think it's a criminal act in every sense of the word.
I mean, it speaks to so many of the issues actually that you raise, and you mentioned the figure of, you mentioned piracy, and the figure of the pirate emerges through Pulp as kind of a heroic figure, actually. I'm thinking particularly of the Pelagic Tracts, which is a film which traces a kind of fictional history of book smugglers working under or against a colonial administration. And the sense that actually the preservation of knowledge isn't only the responsibility of the dominant power or the state, but actually can be and often is preserved by people working against it or beneath it, or finding ways to work against precisely those kind of destructions of knowledge by the state. And that figure of the pirate libraries, pirate people, and actually writers is in some sense piratical, filmmakers and artists as performing a similar function. It struck me as interesting, this model of the pirate as a preserver of knowledge or a transmitter of knowledge.
Thank you. Yes, I now that you pointed out, I tend not to believe in heroic figures, but yes, it's important sometimes to have a kind of valorization occur, simply because it's an ideal to which one can work. And one of the reasons why I work in outside of frameworks as much as I can, barring Venice. But I try to work outside of the standard ways of standard sort of routes of operation. I think, like I mentioned already, how I don't partake in the whole publishing process, standard mode of working. And the reason is because I find it's exhausting, but also more importantly, it hobbles you. There's a lot of time that gets wasted, and I work extremely quickly. So I wrote the first pulp book in a month, the second in 15 days. You can't do that if you're working conventionally, because I write it in 15 days, but it's 15 days before it needs to be sent to the book designer. So it's really down to the wire. You can't work that way normally. And I think that this this working by the seat of your pants kind of thing is very much how I like to function. I like it when it's really, as I said, down the wire. And I think when I talk about piracy in different forms, I think one of the things that pirates do is they set their own idea of time. They work according to their own notion of when and where. And this is implied even when you look at, of course, the Pelagic Tracts, which you mentioned. That's actually a semi-fictional account. I don't think, there were no book smugglers really. That's an invention, but it's actually an invention for a reason, and that's really to talk about what it means to be a smuggler. A smuggler is really a trader who has no permit or a piece of paper that allows him to trade along that route. So it's about access. Who has the right to do something and who doesn't? And when you're looking at the traders in the region, in the place in which I filmed, there are people who've been trading along that route with Mesopotamia and Babylon. And then along come the European colonizers, three different colonizers, and then they keep preventing them from trading. The Portuguese came and prevented them from trading with the Islamic world, for instance, and so on. So, I mean, it's just a question of regime change, and suddenly your work is illegitimate, and it's illegal. I find parallels in this idea of the pirate library, but also smuggling and so on, because I think it's important to consider what constitutes illegality. The moment because this is one of the lies we have force fed as children, that if it's the law, it must be right. And it's amazing how many people stand by and do nothing simply because it's the law. And they allow injustice to perpetuate and occur and reoccur in front of them because it's the law. And I know this, I'm belaboring the point a bit, but it's also at the core of what I do, because there's no point only recounting moments of violence unless you also examine why they occur with such depressing regularity, but also why they occur with such openness. Most of these actions are not covert. These actions of violence and destruction are spectacles. They play out to our horror, yes, but whose horror? Are we really all truly horrified, or is there an element of fascination and of this happening? We saw it with the Bamia Buddhas. We see it all the time. It's okay to say we are powerless, but I don't think that that's really this wholly true. So I think when you talk about the pirate, I see the pirate also as someone who has freed themselves from this convention of being a horrified / fascinated bystander.
I mean, the whole project can be read can be read quite straightforwardly as an argument against authoritarianism, in the sense that this idea that it's important to preserve different forms of knowledge precisely because that legislates against the kind of authority that can be imposed by a single authority. There's a very nice bit, I think, where you say authoritarian regimes only need one book. And this is in itself, that very simple idea is an argument for the preservation of many books. And not only for the preservation of many books, but for the preservation of ideas which are contrary to what prevails. Yes. And I wondered if you could talk a little bit about censorship and self-censorship, and how, in making the project, you've clearly been quite conscious of bringing in different voices and allowing voices to coexist without shaping them into a narrative. Or actually, I think particularly in the more recent volumes, being very careful to resist narrative, to allow these things, to allow these voices, allow these perspectives to sit alongside each other, and allowing the reader quite a large degree of agency, I suppose, in thinking about how to reconcile them or not reconcile them. How is the model of putting these films, and maybe we can talk about Talking Leaves as well, because I think that does some similar things. How has the actual form you've adopted changed to reflect that, to be polyvalent, let's say, or polyphonic?
I think the form needed to change. It does reflect, of course, the very, very large number of participants that I've now worked with. But I think it also reflects this particular installment of Pulp, where I had to work with a large group of people as well, many different people, multiple editors. A video editor, for instance, I hadn't met before, I didn't know before, a new sound designer, etc. So I think that allowing them to also shape the work is an important way for me to not think of it as think of my work as being precious, but the material, as seen through the eyes of of people who are working on it, becomes very precious to me. And I think that relationship is very interesting. So it's a similar approach to when I work with people I film. I listen very deeply to them. I did the same thing with my video editor and my editors as well. And even if there were times which was quite often, honestly, where I didn't agree at all with their approach, I let it go. And I don't know if I will regret this, because they are, to be honest, there's a lot of talking leaves that I'm not in agreement with. But I think yes, I feel I would have done it very differently if it was just me. But is it necessary for it to be just me? There's been enough of just me in Pulp already. And I can go back to that anytime I want. Doing this for the Venice Biennale, where there's such a large number of people who are going to encounter the work, it was very important for that this not be a solitary, insular exercise. And I'm not an insular person, in the sense where obviously there's a lot of porosity, sorry to use that overused word, in this project. You can see it, you can hear it, it's very visible, as you mentioned already. And so that's there, but there's an insularity which I do know would occur if I were to edit this myself, whether it's the text or the film. So to give it over to someone else means that I allow for a viewership and readership to occur during the production of the work, because that's what they also were. The editors, sound designers, all of them, they ended up being viewers and active participants in the work. So it's really beautiful because I don't see them as doing defined jobs or defined tasks. They are embedded in the work. And that's a really important thing to acknowledge and very beautiful for me to witness, because this is my work in the hands of someone else. Watching my video editor have to go through hundreds of hours of footage, I feel so sorry for him. And having to just make sense of all my really I don't know how to describe my filming method. I film everything. I don't turn it off. So it's a lot of things that, yeah, I don't know how he went through it. But I think that it's really important to have him work through that raw material. And so finally, when Talking Leaves comes together, there were two main considerations. One was that I'm really aware of the fact that because it's the Venice Biennale, attention spans are short, necessarily so, because it's just too much for people to see in a very short time. And it gets exhausting. And I don't like tiring people out. We're all overwhelmed anyway, most of the time. And not in a good way. So what I did was, even though it's a 90-minute long film, if you watch it for between 5 to 8 minutes, you not only get at least one complete story, but you get, and when I say story is a very loose way to describe it, but you get a very clear sense of the ethos of the project. And that's what's the most important thing. That there's an urgency to it, even if you're looking at really beautiful visuals or listening to these voices that speak to you very calmly or sweetly, but there's an urgency. And I think that was very necessary to have as an undercurrent. That's there in the books also, as well in the writing, that there's an urgency and there's a kind of, I don't know how to describe it. It's more than urgency. Actually, there's a desperation, I think, to sort of cut to the heart of things, which is why we can't seem to get out of this habit of evolve rather out of our dealing of destruction and death. And I don't know why we can't do it. I know it sounds really naive, but I'd rather be naive and idealistic than be cynical about the fact that there's an eventuality. I don't know if that fully answered, because it was the first half of your question that I think that slipped my mind now that
No, I think this idea of relinquishing control actually speaks
yes.
in a really interesting way to what you were saying about finding different ways to be vulnerable, which was a word that you used earlier. And actually, this idea of vulnerability and this idea, it seems to chime quite interestingly with what you were saying as well about uncertainty, about allowing yourself to be in a position of not knowing, of not controlling, of not having total authority about the message and how it's communicated, and actually entering a space which is both uncertain and vulnerable. And so much of the project feels like it works towards this idea that actually, there's almost kind of Socratic idea that actually that we become wiser by becoming more aware of how little we know, and actually relinquishing the idea that we are totally even able to comprehend, the world in which we live fully. That we can only recognize the existence of many different forms of knowledge, many different ways of thinking, many different truths, and that actually to learn, and maybe what feels like it's happening in the course of this project, is that you're learning how much there is still to learn, how much exists, how much knowledge there is to be preserved, and how, as you said at the start, this project is potentially endless, because that attempt to learn everything or to experience everything or to encounter all these different forms of knowledge is by definition unachievable. And that direction, this vulnerability, this uncertainty, feels like, I don't know, almost like the ethics of the book seems to be towards this idea, this uncertainty, this curiosity, this humility, maybe. I don't know if is humility a fair word to use? Maybe not.
I don't know. I mean, I think one needs to be quite necessarily preoccupied to the point of sort of in quite a selfish way to be able to do this sort of work. There's a fair bit that one can't do or one has to give up on, and that includes relationships and people to be able to do something like this. I think that's okay. That's all right. I think it's okay to have, and I think it's necessary sometimes to have things that are larger than oneself. But in this case, I don't know if I mean, I can't claim the word humility because that negates it instantly. I think that I would rather talk about futility because that's something that's easier for me to speak about as an artist also. I can't tell you how many proposals I've seen from art students that speak about futility. So I don't know if it's a symptom of art school or whatever. But I remember feeling this when I started this project as well, that it could be a futile chronicle, but in the making of it, you counter that futility. And that's simply because even if you cannot delineate fully, or if you even cannot describe or even describe the parameters, if not the content fully of the vastness of human knowledge production, generation, and access, at the very least, you can point to that corpus. You can point to that idea of the book as a kind of collective humanity and an embodiment of that. I think, God, these are such grandiose terms. Please forgive me, but I think that at the very least, it could be a signpost. That's it. I mean, even that's good enough. Even if at the end of 10 years, this project is, it means that you can spend 10 years on something like this and it's still not even go beyond a certain point, go further beyond a certain point. It just shows that this is something to marvel at, the sheer vastness of it. It's like they attempt to count grains of sand on a beach sort of thing. I mean, just this idea that it's okay to do something that is seemingly futile, but the act of doing it is a way of describing as well that this vastness exists and will continue to exist because we do continue to produce. I think what is unfortunately not named often enough is that we quite historically we've consciously impoverished our record. There's no question of it. Our written storehouses and even our oral storehouses, so much has vanished and continues to vanish. But I think that in our time, the problem is one of monetization. It's not active destruction. It's not even censorship in its obvious ways. It's actually sort of the teaching of self-censorship, which is something you mentioned earlier, and I would like to just come back to that. This is something I have to battle constantly. I even, to the point where I even mentioned it in my curatorial note for the Kochi Biennale, when I wrote that the only enemies are apathy and self-censorship. I think it was something like that I wrote, or despair, because that's really dangerous. I mean, that is something we're quite successfully being taught how to hold ourselves back, how to tone police, and that's when I spoke about pacifism as being the last word. I actually didn't realize didn't realize it was a form of policing tone. How dare I think that it was an acceptable position to take when violence is a perfectly legitimate tool in the hands of the disempowered or the dispossessed? So I think that what I'm trying to say in my usual roundabout way is that yes, you have futility, but it's very important to also name things. And even if you cannot describe them fully or catalog them, actually the word is catalog, one doesn't need to catalog things. A catalog entry, for instance, it's a proof of existence, yes, but what does it actually prove? For instance, you can have miles of newspapers on a shelf, but just one entry in a catalog. It can exist as a single entry, but it's a proof of its existence, not of its form, but it's a proof that it's there, which is also why catalogs are frequently targeted for destruction, by the way. And this is again very much part of my approach, that we think we accumulate as we grow older, and as you talked about that wisdom of understanding this. But as I've gone along this project, I feel I remember a lot less than when I started. I feel like the knowledge that I held in my head, not in my phone, not bookmarked somewhere, not printed out, or not in a book, but something in my head, I remember a lot less now, simply because that vast accumulation that I was doing meant that my brain had to sort of act like a clearinghouse and sort of discard a lot of information. So I'm less articulate now about this project than I was at the outset. I'm rendered inarticulate by the sheer mass of information that I've encountered and produced also. So this is the first time I've admitted it, actually.
It's a rather beautiful idea, this idea that your memory, almost your identity, has been dispersed into this project. I remember there's a point I think you say probably in the first volume, maybe at the start, you say something like, "I disavow my genetic heritage in favor of my literary inheritance," something like this. And actually, the sense that this project might, in some sense, be an autobiographical one. That actually, this is a way of exploring what it means to belong to communities that are predicated on knowledge rather than on genetic material. Has it changed your relationship to yourself and to communities and the way that you think about yourself in relationship to the people you're meeting, the communities you're entering?
Absolutely. My sense of aloneness has been reinforced. The more that I form these connections, the more convinced I am that I'm not part of any community. It's a liberating idea, and I'll explain why in a moment. But I really love what you just said about the how this is an autobiographical thing in a sense. I think what this project, if we're speaking in autobiographical terms, I think by the time I finish this project, it'll really actually be a timeline of my mental degeneration in terms of memory and my ability to recall and my ability to be very clearly articulate about what it is I really want to say with pithy examples and so on. I don't have that ability the way I did at the outset of this project, which is interesting, because I think when you shake your convictions up so much, you're second guessing yourself constantly, and that's also an act of tremendous self-censorship, by the way, that I enact constantly. So I'm able to be a little more honest with you, Ben, but usually I hold back a fair bit, and that brings me actually to the second bit of what you just mentioned, which I think has slipped my mind actually. How funny! This is an example of what I'm talking about. Sorry, you'll have to remind me about what the last bit of
No, I can't remember
what you
either,
said.
and I can't remember, and I have no excuse.
See, this is what I mean with because there's just so
not
much to
having
talk about.
perpetrated it in your project.
Um, how embarrassing for me. But I think this happens because there's so much I really want to say, and there's so much going through my mind when I listen to you, that by the time I get around to answering, my brain's just done a wipe.
But I wonder if it's also something a little bit like, isn't it the difference between being, writing from writing is such a solitary occupation, and even being an artist in the conventional sense, let's say in the narrower sense, is such a solitary occupation, literary solitary occupation, and actually one is in one's own head the whole time. And actually, this is quite a dramatic shift in the way that a mind operates, or the way that you operate, to be, almost functioning. The project functions as a clearinghouse, as you say, for all of these different voices, for so many different experiences to come in, that it's inevitable that I don't know, one would lose something of that. I mean, I wonder, maybe this isn't too big a jump, but there is a kind of analogy to the work of a curator in that sense, that your own personality is necessarily downplayed, and you, instead of expressing one's individual self in the conventional sense, you're instead tasked with creating an infrastructure that can house an extraordinary variety of personalities and an extraordinary variety of different perspectives. Is there something analogous in your experience of working as a curator, and perhaps in your experiences as someone who recently has been creating these very loose, very open structures within which to house so many different experiences from so many different people? Have you found one useful in terms of the other? And how has that affected your own art production, your own work as a writer in the classical sense?
Thank you. Actually, that reminded me of what I'd forgotten. I'd mentioned, yes, I love the haha. I mentioned that it's liberating to feel aloneness and to not belong to a single community. And I said I'll explain why. I want to mention why, because this actually factored into the way I curated the Kochi Biennale. My ancestors quite shamelessly married for love, always. So I don't belong to a single community or caste group or linguistic group, and this saying something coming from India. It means that I don't have any ancestral home or roots or any of that, and it's incredibly liberating, really, when you come from a place that is so hidebound in its caste traditions and the viciousness of all that entails. it means that I could be indiscriminate not only with the way I met with and interacted with and worked with and with people and the relationships I had, but also in the way I valued people. I still can't read caste the way other people can. They'll be like, oh yeah, that's a typical, and they'll mention something. And to me, it's still alien speak, because no one ever spoke like that at home, and no one understood how to speak like that. It means, of course, that there's a downside to this. The only language in which I'm fluent is English. I call it the poverty of my singular language, because I don't have a mother tongue, so to speak, because everyone, like I mentioned, in my family came from different backgrounds. So English was the medium in which we all interacted with each other. So all of this meant that I've grown up without a community as a buffer. Also, sometimes community is a controlling mechanism. We know that it conditions you. It's a conditioning more than controlling. A conditioning mechanism. It's where your biases get inbuilt, and where they become ingrained and inseparable from your sense of self and how you look at the world. So I didn't have any of that, but that also meant that when I got the chance to curate Kochi, the Kochi-Muziris Biennale, which opened last year, I got to do what I've always loved the idea of doing, and which I've spoken about, and I got to finally do it, which was to build a community. If you're going to invite 90 artists to a Biennale, you are perforce building a community, and that's just the first level. And then we look at the whole sea of volunteers, workers, of all sorts, who come together to make an exhibition of this scale go up. And you're now looking at, I don't see them in roles or as jobs, which is again a casteist idea that this is a carpenter, this is a painter, and then they don't speak to each other because there are these hierarchies. I don't ascribe to any of that. So for me, it doesn't matter who, what job people perform. It's who they are as people that's of primary importance to me. So yes, I am the curator, but I am also an artist, yes. But I'm more importantly, I'm Shubigi, and I invited these people along, and I'm working with all these people to get this huge exhibition up. And all of this consideration was there. I never spoke about it before because it was so obvious to me that I never thought it needed explaining. I mean, that's the whole point of doing a Biennale, isn't it? It's not about some brand new original curatorial framework that's going to make your name. All those things are really boring to me, and I'm not particularly interested in that. Here was a chance for me to actually do something that would embrace the ethos of the Kochi-Muziris Biennale, which is that it's one of the few places in the world where you can be openly political. You can be openly, you can question regimes, you can question a lot of structures, religion, and so on, that you can't do in a lot of the places, including where I live, which is Singapore. So there was so much freedom of thought and decision and choice and what is made visible. There's so much I could do. I'm not beholden to any of the art world people in India either, or anywhere in the world, really, to be honest. So I also knew there's not that I could counter a lot of the nepotism that bedevils the art world. It also meant I could make visible people who weren't visible, and there was so much possibility here that it was heady almost, and as I'm sure everyone knows by now, it was a very fraught Biennale, especially towards the end. The 4-year the process didn't help. You kind of lose momentum and lose steam. A lot of the projects that I'd commissioned then were no longer commissioned projects, and that's okay. I always worked with the artists with what they wanted first. So, for instance, if an artist, if they were producing something that in 2019, 2020, and then because we postponed, they were showing it somewhere else, I was like, go ahead. I don't have to be the first to show your work. That doesn't matter. You show what you're comfortable with when the time comes. That's it. So because Biennale should not be sources of pressure and stress. And I think that again comes from an idea of community. A community is not a gathering of people. It's about listening to what it is that is upsetting, distressing, and how to counter it and buffer against it. So as it turned out, when the time came around, by the time we neared the opening and then the eventual final postponement by 10, 15 days, it was very important that this community had been built, because the artists really came together. They helped each other install. Everyone worked together. It was really incredible. The reason that exhibition went up the way it did in a record 10 days is because everyone really put their backs to it. And we were there for each other in emotional ways and as support for each other. We built our own systems, really from the ground up to get it going. And that's something that sort of flexibility and adaptability is something I've always had with Pulp, but it's not, I can't take credit for this. This is really the work of people on the ground. Like I mentioned already, the workers and the volunteers and mediators and all of them, but the artists are really incredible. It's this group of people who just everyone worked with each other, and they didn't have to agree with each other. There were a lot of points of disagreement, and when you're in a very very stressful situation, it's important to not be in agreement with each other. You should not have complete concordance of view. I am immensely proud of this exhibition because not only because of the the sort of situation it's the sort of what it went through, what we went through, all of us, to get it up, but more importantly because of the quality of the work, the honesty of the work, the fidelity of the work to the ideas and the intentions of the artists. Simply put, there's no bullshit there. So very very proud of that exhibition.
Well, that feels like a good place to finish. The idea of building infrastructures that can accommodate important work even in the face of the most difficult conditions, and God knows we're living through a moment in which that's it's a widely applicable thing. Shubigi, I think we could probably, as with your whole project, we could probably carry on talking forever, but we should have to implement time constraints. But I wanted to say thank you so much, and to encourage everyone who's listening to go and see the Kochi-Muziris Biennial if they can, and to track down the films and books, particularly of the whole project. Shubigi Rao, thank you so much.
Thank you, Ben.